So if you want to build a quad, but you don't know anything about a quad, how do you build a quad? This is going to hopefully answer that question through explaining my journey from having no quad to having a quad. And this is basically not going to be a super simple thing. If you want a super simple video that's going to explain, oh yeah, this so-and-so DJI is going to be nice and simple to fly with a smartphone, great. But I decided to learn something about quads and build it and make mistakes, but learn from that. And this is going to be like a summary of my journey from knowing nothing about it to finding a YouTube video that looked really cool from a YouTuber that's called Johnny FPV and thinking, wow, that's fantastic, I want to be able to do that. And I just decided I'm going to start trying it. So I researched, I spent lots of hours watching YouTube videos, I then started watching videos about how to build them or whether to buy it and the comparison between that. I then found videos explaining how you can build it for £100 or about $100, I guess. And I was blown away by the potential affordability of buying a really fancy, nippy quad that's going to be all powerful and exciting. So, this is my quad. This is now about 2 months into my quad journey. It was about the beginning of the year 2018 I decided it would be a fun thing to try and do. So I went ahead and started researching. So I found you could 3D print frames, which is what I ended up doing. But I was not sure whether that would work. I ended up watching some videos. There's one I'll link to in the description. And I ended up finding controversial things as to whether it would be better or worse than buying the typical carbon fibre frame. And I thought, well, maybe having a carbon fibre frame would be better, because it might be lightweight, it might be better, but I was thinking, well, I've already got a 3D printer, I don't need to spend money, I can just spend potentially like a few pounds and spend a tiny amount of money and a little bit of effort finding the files and printing them, and end up with something that's actually really quite good. And this is what I ended up with. Now this is a design called a Pion 230. So 230 is the diagonal dimension between the propellers, and the Pion is just the name that the designer gave it. It's basically a racing quad that's got lots of options and flexibility, so you can have different arms depending on whether you want to have different size motors. You can have different mountings, there's lots of different mounting options, there's lots of holes and straps options, so you can tie stuff down where you want to do it. Which just gives you a bit of flexibility when you're building, because you don't have to follow a specific list of pieces. So I printed all the pieces out and thought, fantastic, I've got a quad. But I had to then attach it all together with all the screws and nuts and bolts and standoffs and things. So I had to start ordering. So I printed the parts and thought that was fun. I then had to buy everything. And this was the bit that took me a couple of weeks. I spent quite a lot of time unsure really whether it was going to end up working, because everything I was looking at was cheap Chinese components that were apparently, according to all the reviews from the websites, really good, and they did the job really well, and they're really powerful and good value and cheap. Great, sounds perfect. But then you see other reviews of people saying it's just a rip-off, it's a clone, it's a fake, and it'll break really quickly. And I was obviously a bit like, well, I don't want to buy stuff that breaks. Turns out everything kind of worked, but then some things didn't. Now I know what I've kind of went wrong on mine. I know kind of what to work around. So I'll try and explain the kind of choices I made that were good and the choices I made that were bad. So the website I used was Banggood. They are a bit like AliExpress. They sell components from all around the world, and they sell lots of different items. So it's a bit like Amazon, basically, but it's shipped free internationally. So I got most of my components from Canada, America, China, all over the place. Some from the UK, some from France, and they were all shipped, some of them in 4 days, internationally for free. And that really blows my mind, because I was thinking, oh, if I'm going to have to order stuff from America, it's going to cost me loads of import fees. Ended up, I haven't paid a single penny on import fees for any of this. I've ordered about £150 of stuff from abroad, didn't pay any extra. I was expecting another £50 bill of, oh yeah, you've got to pay all these import fees. But no, that didn't happen. So, some of the bigger kind of components I bought, right in the centre of the quad, there's the flight controller, which is this piece here. That one is a slightly kind of fancy, but still a very low quality flight controller. It is, it's called HGLRC is the company, and it's an F4 flight controller, which is just kind of a designation given to different powers of flight controllers. So F3 is pretty common and cheap, but F4 is the newer one. So apparently 32-bit processing, which means it can control itself better potentially. So I bought this, but it's also an all-in-one, which meant it came with a few other components that I would have had to buy separately built into it. So as well as having the flight controller, which basically means it knows which way is flat, and if you tell it to tip left, it'll tip left, and it'll tip right, it'll tip right. It knows what angle it's at, and it does the computing for that. It doesn't handle any of the power. It just handles the signal that says go a bit faster, go a bit slower. And the flight controller normally just does that. But this one also has the battery controller, which means, turn it around the other side, the battery is inputted into the flight controller. And it's also distributed out. You may be able to see those red and black wires coming out. And they go to the speed controllers, which are on each of the arms. And the speed controllers handle a lot of power in, and they get a signal that tells them whether to modulate that up or down to basically tell this propeller go up a bit or go down a bit. That's kind of what the speed controller does. It also, the flight controller comes with a video transmitter, which I haven't got plugged in at the moment because I haven't got to the camera perspective, the camera kind of part of quadcopters yet. It's another milestone I'll get to at some point once I've kind of got everything working properly just on the basic quad. So the flight controller was about £40. Now I bought, get the packet so you can see, I bought one of them, which is in here. Now this one I managed to kind of destroy. It wasn't really deliberate at all, but basically one of the connectors on the bottom, these are white connectors, there's one here, and there was one over here. This one is not there. Basically it got ripped off when I tried to unplug a connector. Conveniently, the website I bought it from managed to do a replacement because I kind of explained it was very, very fragile. It shouldn't have broken under the pressure it was put under. I literally just unplugged a very small connector, this connector down here, and because it broke, they ended up shipping me a new one, which is wonderful because that's a £40 component, and I just broke it. As soon as my quad was about to be ready, it pulled off, and I was like, oh, that's a shame. And kind of annoyed I'd somehow broken the pretty vital component. So, flight controller was pretty okay choice. So that's the only kind of electrical component I've really had to go wrong with the quad, is the flight controller, which I then got a replacement for, so that's fine. Motors were about £5 each, and they're really, really good. They don't seem to have a problem at all. Speed controllers were, again, about the same. They were very cheap, didn't have anything that went wrong with them. They work fine. The only other real component, I guess, is the receiver. So the transmitter was about £35, and that came with the transmitter and the receiver, which is a pretty nice cheap bundle because usually they can be very, very expensive. So it was nice to be able to get that at a pretty affordable price. And that's most of the electrics on the quad. There is obviously the camera, which I'm going to end up mounting on the top here, on this little like rubberized shock absorbing platform. That's going to be where I'll mount a GoPro or similar. That can just kind of zip tie or strap on top. And then down here is where the first person video camera will be if I get one of those. So that's most of the quad. The choosing of parts, the bits that I went wrong on, maybe I should have saved a bit of money and bought, rather than a £40 flight controller, you can get them for about £10–15 for cheap ones that are very basic. Now, I may have ended up having to spend more later on because I've already got a video transmitter built into mine, and I've already got a battery controller built into mine, so it was simplified things for me, and I thought that might be a good choice for beginning this hobby. Rather than making it very complicated, I thought I'll simplify stuff. and that may have been a good option. I'm not quite sure. The motors I'm fine with, speed controllers I'm fine with. The receiver, I noticed now that it's a 6-channel receiver, which means you have throttle, you have yaw, you have pitch left and pitch forwards, which is 4 channels. You also have 2 switches, which one of them I use for arming the quadcopter, and one of them I have for switching the mode. But there are also several other channels. There's 4 channels that or 4 controls, inputs on my controller that I can't use. There's throttle, there's yaw, which is that left and right. There's pitch forward, pitch back, pitch left, pitch right. There's also this left-hand switch, which arms the quadcopter when it's down. There's this one, which has 3 modes. At the moment, I just have it as a hold, and then a horizon mode. Hold just holds the quadcopter in whatever angle you put it in. Horizon will level it, so it will stay flat. And then if you tip right, it will tip right and then go flat again. But there is also a switch on this side, a switch on this side, and there's a little adjustable dial, 2 of them in the middle. And none of those I can use because I'm using the ones I've already assigned, and there's only 6 channels, so I can't use the extra 4 things because I've only got 4 channels. However, you can get 10-channel receivers for slightly more, and I probably would have preferred to have had a fully functional controller. Possibly. So, that's the receiver. I may have chosen slightly differently, although maybe it's a good idea to stay cheap. That's all the components, really. I also bought a battery charger. I'll get to the battery situation later, but I bought a battery charger and had some problems with that, which I'll address in a bit shortly. The quad components were all kind of okay at that point. After I'd broken the part and fixed it, that was fine. The soldering, I'd really recommend getting a brand new nice soldering iron. Just spend £15 on a nice simple one, because it made so much difference. I, to begin with, was trying to solder components together and had a really old and really big flat-ended soldering iron, and it was such a nightmare trying to solder anything together. It worked, but it was awful. So I ended up kind of desoldering stuff, and especially because that was used before the new flight controller. So the new flight controllers only used the new soldering iron. But the new soldering iron I got was just £13 or something, and just worked really, really well. Bought it off Amazon, it was nice and simple. Did the job really well. That was great, having the ability to solder properly, and I think that made a lot of difference when I was building my quad. It was very difficult when I was first doing it, and then much easier after I had a better soldering iron that was much hotter and much more precise. Broken components. I've mentioned already which ones broke, so it's just I had to be kind of careful with the sockets that I ended up pulling. Well, I pulled one of them off the flight controller because it was so fragile. So this is the charger I used, and I have a 4-cell battery here, and I have some 3-cell batteries in my in the bag. Now, because these have multiple individual battery cells, they each need to be the same voltage. So you have a balance charger, which makes sure that you plug in the main power, and you also plug in this balance connector. And that means you can ensure that each of the cells is getting the exact same voltage, or as close as you can. Which means you don't end up with a battery that has one cell that's really powerful and one cell that's not, because then you end up with kind of big problems, and it gets quite dangerous. So you've got to charge them balanced, just so it charges equally and doesn't cause you lots of fires and explosions. So this charger worked perfectly fine out the box. Sounded a bit fragile, but nothing wrong with that at the point of when I was using it the first 3 or 4 charges. Then it suddenly decided every time I plugged it in, it was going to hold down the enter button by itself without me touching anything. Which meant as soon as I plug a battery in, it goes, put it in this mode, charge it at this power, you don't get a chance to change anything. Which meant every time I plugged a battery in, it was trying to charge it at the wrong settings, and I just had to turn it off at the wall, make it turn off as quickly as possible so it didn't blow up any of my batteries. Now that, to me, is very, very bad, because these batteries are dangerous if you charge them wrong. The charger should mean if you put it in the right settings, this will always be okay being charged by this. But this basically failed. I feel like because this was a £16 charger made by IMAX, and it's not exactly a very genuine product, it may be a bit of a bad choice. Bit of a nice wobbly noise, and if I tip it, just the buttons fall out. So what the hell? It's just so disappointing. The fact this broke really kind of was a shock. I was like, damn, that's the component I thought would be very good and might work properly. But no, it didn't. It did not. So the last thing I've just ordered is a slightly improved battery charger by Turnigy from Hobby King. Same brand as the batteries I've got. Batteries are Turnigy graphene batteries. This is basically the same charger, and when you plug in the battery to this, it'll do exactly what the other charger did. This one has a fan, which is nice. It also has slightly better sounding buttons that seem a bit clickier and more normal. So that might be a better, longer lasting charger, rather than one that who knows whether it's going to work, who knows whether it'll end up exploding. You just don't know with these kind of things. This charger's been working great ever since I've had it. I did end up getting a refund for the balance charger that broke, which was fantastic because it meant I didn't technically waste any money on it. I just had a potentially dodgy charger that I got a replacement for, or a refund for. I spent that refund and an extra £10 and bought a slightly better one. So this is a £25 charger. It has the same function, but probably will last longer. And that's kind of a pretty important thing to have, is a reliable battery charger. I also bought this LiPo safe bag, so it's fireproof or fire resistant, so I can put all my batteries in there, because if we've got 3 batteries which if charged wrongly can explode, or if they're punctured they can explode, I don't want to have that, or if it does I want it to be in somewhere like a bag that can resist the fire and stop it exploding my house. The only other thing I'll mention is that I had a few little kind of mistakes when I was flying. So once everything was working, I guess, I ended up having this battery on my quad, and I have the main power connector that goes into where the main power connector goes into. I then had this balance connector just dangling. Now that seems fine because it's probably not going to dangle in the way, but it did. It went straight down into one of the propellers and started getting chopped up, which meant it was exposed one of the pins. So I ended up having to order for about 50p a set of connectors. So that's why this one has a white connector, whereas the other batteries had black connectors. Other than that, the only other thing I'll say, I learnt that batteries come in very different shapes and sizes. The cell count affects the thickness, from what I can tell. So these are both the same voltage. These are both the same ampage, so they're both 1.3 amp hours. But this one is a 4 cell, which means it has 4 3.7 volt cells, and this one's a 3 cell, which means it has 3 cells of 3.7. And in total, I think the 3 is probably fine for now. The 4 I just bought as a, hey, I might end up wanting it later on and don't want to have to order another one straight away if I needed it. So I wasn't sure, because the quad's quite heavy, maybe I would need more power. I definitely don't. It's definitely got enough power. Extra cell makes it slightly thicker. You can see there's a slight extra thickness in the cells and the battery. However, if I then compare these two side by side, these are both the same number of cells, but one's much thinner and much longer. And being longer, it takes up a lot of space on the quad. So if I ever use this battery, I kind of have to have it half dangling off the back, because if I have it going up to there, it sticks out by a kind of chunk. Whereas if I have this battery, it seems almost like it was made for this quad. It fits perfectly. It's got plenty of space. Connector can go down and plug in. It doesn't stick out anywhere. Nice and light. Doesn't affect much. Now that battery I think seems like a good option. I got a different size because I wasn't sure whether a bigger battery might last longer. It may weigh more, so it might be less manoeuvrable. I wanted to kind of investigate and learn about it. So I bought 3 different batteries. I've used the 2 3 cells so far, and gone through a couple of cycles of each and flown it for probably an hour or so in total. Because I'm only flying it slowly, I haven't really got through them quickly, so each battery gives me about 15 minutes of sitting out flying it, but that's only because I'm flying it for a minute, then I'll land it, go up to it and take off again. So it's probably going to be a small battery later on in the use of my quad, but at the moment it seems adequate. So the batteries seem very good at the moment. The charger I have, also pretty good choice at the moment. Other than that, I remember at one point I'd built the quad and I was pretty happy with it. And then I decided to revisit the cable tidying, and I just tried to kind of figure out a better way of wiring some of the cables. So I actually ended up putting on some, I had black electrical tape over the speed controllers. I ended up taking that off and putting shrink wrap on it, which made a big difference. It made it look a lot nicer. I also kind of changed where the aerials were. Now this may be a bit of a weird option, but the aerials are at the moment down here tucked under, but they were sticking upwards out the back, which ended up interfering when I had the slightly longer battery. They were poking it, so I didn't really want them to get chopped or anything. So I just kind of rerouted some of the cables around just to tidy it up a bit, because I felt like I'd put it together, flew it, and then I was like, oh okay, that kind of works, and then ended up potentially having problems that I've avoided now by tidying cables a bit. So it's definitely kind of been a good choice. Everything's working now fine. Just as a kind of test, I guess I can spin propellers on idle just to show you it works. Turn on the remote. And then arming it just spins the rotors slightly. That's pretty kind of cool. It's quite fun watching it. But it has a lot of power. It has a lot of power, more than it needs for a beginner. So the actual flying of the quad has been pretty okay. I've managed to keep it under control pretty easily. I haven't been able to do anything too crazy. I have managed a few flips. I've also crashed a few flips. That's just because I'm being silly. Little things that become difficult very early on is if it faces forwards and you tip it left, it will turn, or it'll lean left and move left. If you tip it right, it'll move right. But then as soon as it goes this way, you tip forwards and it's going this way, tip back, it's going that way, and right and left. And then at other angles, it becomes even more confusing. So it's kind of a thing you end up having to figure out is just how to keep it oriented. Because I'm flying by line of sight, I've got to be aware of where my quad is, and I've got to have a kind of good idea of, if I push it forwards, which direction is it going in. So that's become the kind of more difficult challenge early on. But it's not too difficult to kind of learn that. I'm just kind of getting used to flying it, getting used to controlling it in a small area. Well, it's a big open area. I go to a big field that's pretty empty, and then there's no houses around or anything, so it's nice and clear. And I just keep it a few meters off the ground, flying it around, just doing little figure of eights and stuff like that, just so I can get used to it without having to crash it lots and stuff. It has crashed an awful lot. All it does is chop up grass and stays the same. It doesn't break. Nothing's broken on it. No propellers are broken. I'm pretty surprised at that. I thought they'd be breaking every time I touch the ground. But it's nice not having to have thought about that at all. I've even had some friends that have flown it. They've given it a quick go for a few minutes, and they've managed to kind of fly it without having too much problem. It's not a difficult quad to fly. It's just very powerful. So if you give it a big input, it will really move quickly. If you accelerate lots, it will fly upwards really, really quickly. It's not like I'm going to go upwards. It's disappears. So you've just got to be careful with it. So I made some adjustments. So when I first was flying, I had the default rates, which means if I move the pitch a bit to the side, it would move the quad a bit to the side. But it was a bit too sensitive, so if you made a very small adjustment, it would move quite significantly. It would be quite sudden. So what I've done is I changed it to what apparently are better beginner settings, which means if you do little movements in the centre, don't really change that much. They're not that major. If you want more power, you have to kind of get past that little kind of slightly softer zone in the middle. Doesn't happen with the throttle. The throttle's pretty linear, but it's the same with the yaw. I just kind of gentled it, so you can do a little manoeuvre a bit easier without having to be really careful. You can be a bit more average, which is kind of better, I think. Again, another little improvement I ended up bumping into. I decided it was not working out very well when I was landing it. In the field I landed in, it would, before I added these feet on, it would land and then start hitting the grass, and it would chop the grass, and it would get grass wrapped around the propellers, and it was always a bit of a nightmare. Every time I landed it, I had to pick it up again, go and plop it back on an empty zone of grass, so it was like just mud, so it wouldn't chop any grass when it tries to take off. So I ended up finding a file that I could 3D print that was these feet, which just add an extra inch or two onto the quad, which just give it a bit more height, just so it's standing off the ground. The propellers are now like 2 or 3 inches off the floor, which is a lot better than being an inch and a bit off the floor. So this should mean, although I haven't flown it with these feet yet, it should just mean it's a bit easier to take off and land without having to be really careful putting it down in somewhere that's not got any grass, which was a bit of an annoyance. So I 3D printed that, and that was a nice upgrade. So that's the summary really. In all, everything I've bought has worked out eventually. It just meant I made some weird choices that ended up breaking, and I've made better choices now based on that. So the battery charger, maybe get a better battery charger, because they're very important. You don't want a dangerous situation because of being cheap, and that's kind of what I ended up doing initially. Batteries I've got have been great so far. All the electrical components in the quad have been completely safe so far, other than the one piece that I accidentally broke because I was maybe a bit heavy-handed. So I think it's been a good learning process. I've learnt a lot, and it's become quite interesting finding out solutions to all these things I've had go wrong. And now I guess I'm going to continue on this journey of making quads. No doubt I'll have videos on my channel soon of flying it, because it's obviously going to be fun to fly and fun to film. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed my half-hour rant about how my quadcopter has come to be. If you want to ask anything, or you want to request any more information or answers about things you've got, let me know. Or if you've got any tips for me, if you're watching this and you know more about it than I do, let me know, because I'm all ears about finding out more about my hobby. So yeah, I look forward to seeing you in other videos. I'll have videos up of me flying this soon, so you can see how it performs and whether it seems like something you're interested in trying. It's been a great fun to do. There's very little that I feel hasn't taught me a lesson, therefore all the mistakes I've made have been worthwhile. I'm very glad it's kind of all happened, and I'm very glad I decided to randomly spend £150 on building a quadcopter for no apparent reason other than why not. So yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in another video. Goodbye.